with Water Legacy. All right, welcome back to Crosse Talk PM. 608-785-7914 is the text line. If you want to shoot me a question, you got questions about, I guess, like water in general, the safety of water, these mining projects happening in northern Minnesota. And I don't know, Paula, if you're gonna know if any of these things like end up starting to affect the rest of the nation, or even like we're in Wisconsin. So are some of these mining projects, are they going to start to affect other areas? But I bring you on. Paula Maccabee is with the Water Legacy. Are you the director there, Water Legacy Advocacy Director?
I'm the advocacy director and the legal counsel.
All right. First off, can you just explain to us what Water Legacy is?
Sure, and thank you so much, Rick, for letting me talk. Water Legacy is a nonprofit organization formed in 2009 to protect Minnesota's waters and the communities, both ecological and human, that depend on Minnesota's clean waters. And a lot of our work came into being because people in the community were concerned about the threat of copper-nickel mining. And the concern about copper-nickel mining and the Minnesota regulators' inability to protect water in the face of the money and power of the mining industry, in my opinion, it has grown rather than diminished, even though we have had many legal successes since 2009.
All right, so this is not a new issue. So is the PolyMet project that's going on in northern Minnesota, has that been something that you've been fighting since 2009?
Absolutely, and PolyMet began its environmental review process in 2005.
Oh, wow.
And one of the strongest reasons for our formation of Water Legacy by citizens who live in northern and northeastern Minnesota is the draft environmental review that was coming out from PolyMet in 2009. Okay,
so we've been doing this for, let's see here, 2005, so almost, 17 years? That seems like a long time. That's a long project for a company to want to pull stuff out of the ground.
Well, let me give you a little background so people can understand that it has taken so long because PolyMet is really a poor quality project. In 2009, they put in their initial environmental report, and the Environmental Protection Agency gave it probably the lowest rating that's possible, both that the analysis was unsatisfactory and that the environmental impacts were unsatisfactory.
All right.
And so PolyMet then cut a deal with the Army Corps and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources about the framework of their project, and it really hasn't changed much. And then they finished all their. They went through a huge process with basically 100,000 comments, most of which were against, and hearings, and then they basically didn't change anything that they had agreed to back between 2010 and 2013.
The only problem. They submitted their paper to the teacher. The teacher gave them what? What would you say the grade would have been? A C-, a D, and F?
No, it would have been a flunk.
Oh, they would have failed. And then the teacher goes, you know what? Here's your paper back. If you edit it, add some context, maybe we can get you a passing grade. And they got the paper back, edited it, and submitted it again, but they didn't really edit it, so they failed again. Essentially, they submitted the same work.
They submitted they between their initial environmental impact statement and their supplement and their final. They made only minor cosmetic changes because they basically got some of the agencies to say, these are the very few changes you have to make, and then we'll stand by you. And that was really prior to most of the public comment and certainly the experts in the public and at the tribes going into the analysis in detail. So what this is, the first part of this analysis is that the project wasn't good enough when it was initially proposed, and it wasn't substantially better by the time the final environmental review was done in 2015.
All right.
And then the second stage of the history that's really important to realize is that in 2015 they came out with a final environmental impact statement, and in 2018 they issued their permit. And I think PolyMet assumed that their permits would just sail through and then start digging and polluting the water and destroying the forests and the wetlands.
Well, can we go there for a second? Paula, can we go there for a second? Because you're setting it up, and I should have done a better job of setting up what you're setting up. Is there's a company called PolyMet, which is owned by another company called Glencore, right?
That is absolutely correct.
And Glencore is based in, one of them is based in South America, or maybe both of them are. Where's Glencore based?
Glencore is based in Switzerland, and it has been prosecuted around the world for corruption and bribery, including in England and in Africa. And they are the majority owner of PolyMet, and they have the power to call the shots. They have between 75 and 80% now, I think, is the number of ownership they have.
Yeah, and it's $1 billion corporation, right, essentially?
Oh, $100 billion corporation.
All right, so that
multinational.
So that company is running a PolyMet mine in northern Minnesota. There's also another company out of South America, I can't think of where they're out of. It's owned by, it's like Anglicor, something like that. And there's another mining company near the Boundary Waters that's also controversial. Also another outside group trying to come into Minnesota, an outside country, an outside corporation from another country. And we were kind of talking about this before you came on, but and they're trying to mine upstream from the Boundary Waters. So what is PolyMet? The mining project that PolyMet's trying to do is upstream from, I think, the St. Louis River watershed, which then flows into Lake Superior. Can you just define what PolyMet is doing and the problems that are arising from the mining project that they're proposing?
Well, what PolyMet is proposing to do is to dig a huge open pit mine in the headwaters of the St. Louis River. And the St. Louis River is Lake Superior's biggest U.S. tributary. And also the St. Louis River runs through the city of Duluth, which is Minnesota's third biggest city, and runs right through the Fond du Lac Reservation, Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And the risks of the PolyMet mine are huge amount of acid mine drainage, which means sulfate in the water, and that is a threat to the wild rice that is both in the immediate headwaters of the St. Louis River and at the estuary of the St. Louis River where it comes into Lake Superior. And also, one of the things that scientists have realized in the past 2 decades is that sulfate increases the degree to which mercury gets methylated and then can bioaccumulate in the food chain. So the amount of methylmercury in, let's say, a predator fish like a northern or a walleye could be as much as 1 million times more than in the water itself. And as a result of mining activities, as well as air deposition from coal, there is a huge threat to the people of Minnesota from mercury contamination of fish. And a decade ago, when they still did honest studies, the Minnesota Health Department did a study of mercury in newborns. And in Minnesota's Lake Superior region, 1 out of 10 newborns were born with an unsafe level of mercury. And there are a couple doctors in the Duluth area who are really worried about that. And I asked them, well, what does unsafe mean? And what they told me is that's a level that the literature, the medical literature says, could result in lowered IQ or other learning disabilities. So the threat of PolyMet is wetlands destruction and peatlands destruction and ecological harm, but also harm throughout the community, including the devastation of mercury contamination of fish. And that's really why so many people in Minnesota were so worried about the PolyMet project and are still today worried about it.
We're speaking with Paula Maccabee. She's Water Legacy's Advocacy Director and Counsel. Paula, I got a text question here from Sarge. He goes, what is so valuable in northern Minnesota that this company is spending so much time and probably money? We haven't even gotten into how much money they're spending on this, if it's over well over a decade. But what's so valuable there that they're going after it? Can you explain that?
Sure. What PolyMet is going after and what Glencore is going after is what they call a disseminated deposit, which in layman's terms, is a low-grade deposit of copper and nickel. And the copper and nickel combined is going to be less than 1% of the total amount of weight of rock that they're going to be blasting out of the ground and destroying. So from the point of view of the community, you'd say we're losing forests, we're losing wetlands, we're losing water, and out of 553 million tons of rock, we're going to get less than 1% of anything that's going to be useful. From the perspective of these multinational corporations, they look at that, yes, they have to make investments to dig the hole. But if something goes wrong, the way these are set up is PolyMet is a shell corporation. And so the way the permits are written, Glencore is not responsible for anything. So if there's a tailings dam collapse or pollution or contamination, Glencore can walk away from it, and there's a risk that the Minnesota taxpayers as well as the community will bear the risk. So what PolyMet is looking at is that they believe it's valuable is copper and nickel, and what the community is looking at is thinking is valuable is clean water, wetlands, forests, climate sustainability, and human health.
Yeah, their health indeed. Yeah, it is funny because this is almost the same exact conversation I've had with the Save the Boundary Waters folks, in that what they're pulling out of the ground is the what they want out of what they're pulling out of the ground is, you said it, like less than 1%. So there must be value there. Is there anything beyond that? Do they like having that land, or is it just strictly that? And then what are they doing with that copper and nickel? Because from my conversations with the Save the Boundary Water people, they're shipping that to China to get whatever happens to refine it, right?
Well, most of this copper and nickel is going to end up in China. And initially, Glencore had a merger with a Chinese company, and there was an explicit agreement that the copper from PolyMet would go to China. That agreement may have lapsed because of how long it's taken the PolyMet to get their project underway, and from the perspective of actually going beyond permits to destruction. Unlike some of the pipeline projects, PolyMet is still, its permits have been reversed as inadequate. The permit to mine has been reversed as inadequate. Parts of the water pollution permits have been reversed as inadequate. The wetlands destruction permit has been suspended because of the concerns of the Fond du Lac Band downstream reservation. So this project isn't going to happen anytime soon. And to some extent, it might just be that Glencore's a huge company. They just want to monopolize resources. And their history shows that they have gotten away with projects that do not satisfy best technology standards, that do not pay union wages, and I don't think Minnesota's going to be any different.
All right, we're speaking with Paula Maccabee. She's the Water Legacy Advocacy Director. And when we come back, Paula, you were in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court yesterday, right? Or today? Yesterday?
Yesterday, that's correct.
All right, we'll get into what they heard your argument when we come back. All right, welcome back to Crosse Talk PM. I forgot it's December 1st, so my rule is once December hits, we can play Christmas music. Paula Maccabee is on with me. She's the Advocacy Director for Water Legacy. Paula, do you have a Christmas music rule?
I don't have a Christmas music rule or a Hanukkah music rule. Anytime you want to play something is okay with me. Okay,
well, I feel like you're kind of going after the rule makers here in a way with Water Legacy. I feel like maybe you guys should have a policy about Christmas music, because if it's June, and somebody in the office decides they're going to play Christmas music, you're going to have a problem with that.
I'm not sure about that. It would depend on the specific music and whether I liked it.
All right, so I have Paula on to talk about the mining project that's happening in northern Minnesota from a company called PolyMet, which is owned by a company called Glencore, which we learned is a company that's based in Switzerland, and a company that's wants to mine northern Minnesota, and essentially the same thing that's happening near the boundary waters. Send the little bit of stuff that's useful out of the ground, and send that to China to be refined. And a company, maybe eventually, it sounds like this project's been going on so long, or been trying to go on so long, that they probably don't even know what they're going to do when they get the stuff out of the ground. But it's been called a copper nickel mine. It's also been called a sulfide mine. So first of all, and I'll get to maybe why people in southern Wisconsin should worry about a mining project in northern Minnesota, except for the fact that Lake Superior is a natural habitat, and if it's going to pollute Lake Superior, that should affect us. If it's going to pollute the boundary waters, that should affect us. But why? So copper nickel mine has also been called sulfide mining, and why is that, and why should we care about that, Paula?
Well, copper nickel mining in Minnesota, at least, or in Wisconsin, is the same ore deposit, is sulfide mining. That's because of the geology. It's not that we're trying to come up with a nasty-sounding word like sulfide and sulfur. The copper and nickel is bound to sulfide. And so when that, in the blasting process and the pulverizing process, when that sulfur is exposed to air and water, it creates sulfuric acid. And that means that it creates pollutants for the air, and in water it has sulfate. And that is a chemical that is toxic to wild rice. It decimates wild rice. And a chemical that also increases the methylation and accumulation in the food chain of mercury and making it more dangerous to people. So the deposits of copper and nickel in Minnesota and in Wisconsin are different from iron, which isn't necessarily bound up with sulfur. And so this is a riskier kind of mining. And the other thing about Minnesota, and this is true about Wisconsin too, is Minnesota, northern Minnesota, is a water-rich environment. It's wetlands and streams and lakes. And the track record of sulfide mining is 100% failure in protecting water quality in water-rich areas. It has either resulted in acid mine drainage or toxic metals or both in either surface water or groundwater or both. So it may be possible to do copper nickel mining in a way that doesn't damage the water in an arid environment, but that simply has never proved to be the case in a water-rich environment like Minnesota or Wisconsin.
Yeah, and the problem here, obviously, it's a water-rich environment, but also it's upstream. One potential project is upstream from the boundary waters, which is like 1 million acres of pristine natural habitat, and the other one is upstream from the St. Louis River, and then the St. Louis River watershed, which drains into the Lake Superior, which we don't want to pollute either. Okay, so that is and it sounds like these companies are kind of just are fighting to do this forever, just so that other companies can't come in. So right, they want to. You mentioned it. They want a monopoly on the projects.
Well, this is a really big concern because I think you make two really important points, and that both the boundary waters and the Great Lakes are sort of the world's freshwater resources. And as the climate becomes more uncertain, the necessity for protecting these resources is even more acute. And I guess I see Glencore itself, and, in the Twin Metals, you have other multinationals based in Chile who have the similar track record of disregard of environment and human rights across the globe. Having our resources, our precious resources, subject to their profit motive places a lot at risk, both in terms of Minnesota, but also America's water and freshwater resources. These are really irreplaceable resources, our freshwater and wetlands. They took millions of years to create. And we see the potential of having so much of this destroyed in just a couple decades if we don't take action.
We're speaking with Paula Maccabee. She's the advocacy director for the group called Water Legacy, a nonprofit that functions up in northern Minnesota, kind of fighting. You kind of built yourself around fighting PolyMet, right? Like that's kind of where your roots come from. Are there other projects that you guys are doing to fight for, I guess, water quality?
Yes, we started out and we naively thought that once we took expert science and we pointed out to the agencies that PolyMet was going to be harmful to the environment and didn't comply with the law, that PolyMet would be over. Well, we've been doing this for 13 years, and we're not done. But as a result, what we've also noticed, and this is true in Minnesota. I'm not sure if it's true in Wisconsin, that our agencies keep weakening the water quality standards in order to make it easier to permit these dangerous projects. So we actually spent 11 years just defending the wild rice sulfate standard, and only last year did we finally get a victory that can't be undone. And so Minnesota's rule, which says you can't have more than 10 parts per million of sulfate because it kills native wild rice, that rule isn't going away. But in addition to PolyMet, we've been fighting to protect and prevent rollbacks of water quality standards for toxic pollutants. We are also working in alliance with Honor the Earth because we have a lot of concerns about the Talon Metals project, which is another project, and this one would affect the Mississippi River and the St. Croix River. And also really what is the heart of Minnesota's remaining wild rice breadbasket. I mean, much of the wild rice in the area of northeastern Minnesota is vulnerable because of the history of taconite mining. And now that we're looking at sulfide mining, you can see resources all throughout northern Minnesota, central Minnesota for wild rice, and both the indigenous and non-indigenous community are being threatened.
Well, now we
have a lot on our plate, I would say.
Well, and I think people are starting to go, what? Wait, they're on the Mississippi. There's another mining project. La Crosse is a Mississippi town, so right across the road from me is literally the Mississippi River. So you were in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court yesterday, and you talked about, you're fighting PolyMet, but are you also fighting the EPA and also fighting, is it the Minnesota's essential EPA or Minnesota's DNR? How many groups are you fighting within our own government?
Well, in this case, in the case of the PolyMet water pollution permit, we are fighting for regulatory integrity as well as clean water, because throughout the environmental review process, the Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, was saying, this environmental review is not good enough to allow permits, but we're going to take care of this, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, when we get to the permitting process. And they kept documenting all the issues and concerns they had. And then it came time for the permitting process, and they had these phone calls with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and they said, you need to put in end-of-pipe limits to make sure that the pollution is not more than Minnesota water quality standards, and you need to make sure that you're not violating the downstream standards of the Fond du Lac ban. Well, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency didn't want to hear that, and for the first time ever in Minnesota history, and to the best of our knowledge in the history of this Midwest region of EPA, the state went on a campaign to tell EPA not to submit their written comments saying the permit was no good. And none of the scientists, none of the lawyers, none of the managers who knew anything about water protection wanted to agree with that. But it was the past administration, and they said, we're not going to listen to our own professionals. We're just going to go along with this, and we're not going to submit our comments, even though they were already written. And it was a process of about 2.5 years and a lot of legal work and Freedom of Information Act lawsuits. And we finally got the full record that Minnesota Pollution Control Agency had suppressed these comments. They were some of the strongest comments I've ever seen from the EPA. And the EPA was on the side of the water. And then the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency then deleted all their documents, destroyed the documents that showed that they were basically lobbying EPA politicians. So the case that was argued at the Supreme Court was first about the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is supposed to be an upholder of the law, not an upholder of PolyMet or Glencore's interests. And so a lot of the argument was about regulatory integrity under the Minnesota Administrative Procedure Act and just plain principles of justice and fairness, that an agency shouldn't be able to circumvent the law and keep critical information secret and then issue a permit without taking it into account. So the first issue that I talked about at the Supreme Court was when an agency acts unfairly, unlawfully, and arbitrarily, they shouldn't be rewarded. And then there were sort of two technical legal questions. One is that the law required both the Federal Clean Water Act and the Great Lakes regulations that are just for, Lake Superior and the other Great Lakes, that those laws all required strong end-of-pipe limits on pollution. And this permit kind of stands out because it doesn't have them. And then the other issue is Minnesota has, and this may not be true in Wisconsin, but Minnesota has really protective rules for groundwater. And they, at the very least, would have required liners under all the toxic pollution like the tailings and the waste rock. And PolyMet wasn't required to do that. So there's three issues. One, the agency did wrong, and they shouldn't be able to benefit from that. Two, the permit needed strong end-of-pipe limits. And three, the permit wasn't legitimate, and the PolyMet didn't have a right to put pollution straight into the groundwater when there are technologies that would have prevented that. So those are the really, and they didn't even get a variance from the rule. The state just let them ignore the rule. So those are the big issues, and as you can see, these are issues about protecting water and communities, and they're also issues about protecting a regulatory process so that the laws are followed, and the big boys have to play by the rules just like the little guys.
All right, so the federal EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, had some negative comments or negative science on what the PolyMet mining project in northern Minnesota how it was going to affect the area. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's completely correct.
And Minnesota's Pollution Control Agency, because they're taking public comments on do you want this mine here or not, essentially, at some point, or Minnesota is. And so
that's how it works.
And so what happened there is Minnesota's Pollution Control Agency didn't kind of put forward the EPA science on how bad this would be for the area, and therefore affecting what the public comment would be?
Well, what Minnesota Pollution Control Agency did is they went over the head of all the scientists and lawyers to the political appointees, and so the EPA had written its comments and never sent them to the Pollution Control Agency. And the Pollution Control Agency knew under the law that if they got those written comments, they would have to put them in the record, and they'd have to give them to citizens like Water Legacy who asked for them in Data Practices Act requests, and the press would get them, and then they'd have to respond to them in writing. Mm-hmm. And that would have made it a lot harder to have a weak, inadequate permit. And so the MPCA did not want that, and EPA's political appointees went along with it. And interestingly, the program manager from the EPA, a really good guy, solid guy, he insisted on reading his comments and the comments of his whole team almost verbatim to the staff at the Pollution Control Agency. And we know that because a district court judge in an unusual proceeding requiring investigation that we managed to get required the staff lawyer to share his notes. And they were just really good notes, and they had every single issue. And still, our state agency simply ignored EPA's warning that the permit was too weak and that it violated the law.
All right, so it sounds like we need some heads to roll. Who do we blame? But okay, are any government entities doing anything to kind of impose some rules on these mines? Because it sounds like these mines aren't great for our area. Maybe they're great in the middle of the desert if there's stuff to mine there. I don't know. But are we doing anything to wrap up here, Paula? Are we doing anything in the government to kind of impose some rules?
There are two things that need to be done. One is just stronger standards for mines, period. And there's a lot of talk going on and so forth, no action. The other thing that needs to be done is more respect for tribal sovereignty and tribal involvement in these decisions and considering what the impacts would be on tribes. And I believe the EPA is beginning to make real change in that area, and I'm hopeful that will trigger the kind of respect for human beings and respect for nature that is necessary.
When you left the Minnesota Supreme Court yesterday? Did you feel good about how you presented versus how the PolyMet people, or maybe the EPA, or maybe the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency presented? Who's winning right now? What was the score after you left yesterday?
There's no way to know what the score was. A score is until the Supreme Court makes a decision. I felt our team did a really good job. Water Legacy and Friends of the Boundary Waters and Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy and the Fond du Lac Band. And I also believe that our beef now is not with the Environmental Protection Agency. Our beef right now is let us change the way the state of Minnesota does regulation so that it actually protects people. And I have to say that the whistleblowers at EPA and the EPA manager who came and testified are a big part of the reason why we even have a chance to protect Minnesota water today.
How do the communities around these mines feel? Because I often hear that a lot of jobs will come to these communities, and therefore we want these mining companies coming in.
Well, the communities are really divided because in Minnesota there are community members who rely on fish and wild rice for subsistence, both native and non-native. There are many jobs that depend on recreation, and there are many people who are moving to northeastern Minnesota with money and operating either more innovative businesses, such as solar panels, or operating remote businesses because of the beauty and the healthiness and the wonder of the environment. So there are real strong economic interests in Minnesota in maintaining the quality of our water and the ability to fish and the ability to harvest wild rice.
Well, how's the internet up there? Because that's all going to depend. No, I'm just kidding. Then we get into rural broadband. Do you expect with the government going, the state government going all Democratic, that something might change here, or will it still be, the status quo?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot of change. Exactly. I mean, one of the issues that you're talking about is rural broadband. And in some areas, like along the North Shore, it's fabulous. And there are other areas of Minnesota where it's not. And I think, in terms of infrastructure, we need to have excellent quality internet everywhere. And that would allow the development of more and more businesses that are value-added businesses, where they rely on human capital and human intelligence rather than just dig something out of a hole and it's done and it's gone. So I think that there may be changes, and I certainly hope there will be. And I think also as more people realize the importance of sustainability and the value of having community-based ownership and community-based jobs that are based on human skill, I'm hoping that we will see change.
Yeah, I was thinking like the state government might impose some more strict rules on mining in general. If it's all one, if it's all Democratic or if it was all Republican,
Well, I'm hopeful that there will be stronger rules on mining, and I'm also hopeful that there will be stronger rules about recycling and producer responsibility and protecting wetlands where carbon is sequestered, so that mining becomes, rather than the easy first resort for the multinationals, it becomes the last resort in Minnesota.
All right, that's Paula Maccabee. She's the Advocacy Director for Water Legacy. Paula, thanks for spending the hour with us. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate you having us.
All right, we got to take a break. We'll be back after this. I think I went double Christmas. I think I went the same Christmas song back to back. I don't have a great... I just typed Christmas in the thing. So, all right, December 1st, Christmas music the rest of the month. Well, at least until Christmas, right? UW La Crosse political science professor Dr. Anthony Chergosky is on with us tomorrow. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening, everybody.